I'd like to introduce our next speaker, the keynote speaker, Mieke Bourne. She's the Program Manager for Regreening Africa. Now, if you think that your title might be a bit ambitious, try that one out for size. She's an engagement process specialist. She brings together policy, science, community and practice together, and is very passionate about enhancing relationships within communities and bringing youth along, and has had great success in that area. And I know that's very close to the heart of many of us in Coast and Land Care. Mieke's work has focused in sub-Saharan Africa over the past 10 years, and she came to that after bringing together her two passions for travel and for land and coast repair. So she took opportunity after she had worked on the south coast of Western Australia for several years for the Department of Water and Environmental Regulations in the area of wetland management between Walpole and Esperance. Took herself off to travel across many parts of the world, including India and South America, and ended up volunteering in a paid capacity and was being matched with her skills, with the potential for being in Yunnan province in China or being in Africa. And she landed in Africa, and we're really glad that she did, because some of the lessons that she's got are so pertinent for us in Western Australia. I've known Mieke since she was in high school, in fact, and is a family friend, and I have just watched the impact of her work and her dedication, and I think it's exciting to have that outside perspective of international land care coming back to the home of land care in Australia. So let's warmly welcome Mieke Bourne.
Thank you so much, Lou, and just checking that you can hear me before I continue.
We're just putting the volume up, Mieke.
All right. How does it sound now?
Excellent.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Lou, and for inviting me to present virtually today. As Lou mentioned, my name is Mieke Bourne. I work in Kenya, in Nairobi at World Agroforestry, and I have a very ambitious title of Program Manager for a program called Regreening Africa. And just over 10 years ago, I left Western Australia with many lessons from my work in land care there to come to Kenya. And it's really a great honor to be looking now back 10 years later to come and share some of the lessons that I've seen from this continent, the African continent, back for Western Australia. So just before I start, I just wanted to explain this photo and the image that's behind me. This is something called a closure. It's from Tigray in Ethiopia. And a closure is where there's sort of social fencing and the community agrees to close off an area to regenerate the land, to bring back the trees and the grasses, and can access some of those areas of land. And so I'll come back to that a little bit later. So as Lou mentioned, I came here 10 years ago, and I initially came to support the African Land Care Network. So Land Care came to Africa, to South Africa, many, many years ago, and was actually supported by a number of people within Australia and some even from Western Australia. It came to South Africa to create jobs and for environmental stewardship. And from South Africa, there's been support to create land care networks and land care groups through many of the other countries. So now there's either strong land care or the beginning of land care in all these countries in green on the map. Some of the countries, such as Uganda, now have really strong country networks and even are holding their own conferences. So within my early years, I was very excited to provide capacity development. And you can even see, I think Keith is there. Many people from Australia came over to support up and coming land care facilitators within the African context. After a number of years, I expanded my work beyond land care to working on a number of different programs. So just to give a little setting of where I do work, World Agroforestry is now merged with another organization called C4. And these are the international research centers for both forestry and agroforestry. And they sit under something called the CGIAR, which is a global research a conglomerate of organizations that look at research in development, so focused on the global south. And so they operate at a number of different levels, contributing to global dialogues down to looking at the local, the subnational and the national levels. So at the global level, we contribute to activities such as the recently concluded COP in Glasgow, the UN Food System Summit, which just took place, and the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which was launched this year. Within my day-to-day work, I'm managing a program called Regreening Africa, which I'll explain a little bit more. But I'm also working around stakeholder engagement with evidence across about 17 countries, mostly in Africa and some in Asia, focused on India and Sri Lanka. But I've maintained my connection to Landcare through the Global Landcare Network and sit on the board there. Most of the work that I'm participating in is funded by international donors. Then ACIR and then AusAid, now DFAT has been a strong donor towards some of this work. Now, a little bit about Regreening Africa. So Regreening Africa is a very ambitious program. It's about 24 million euros, so around 37.5 million Australian. And it's running from 2017 to 2022. So next year will be its final year. It aims to reverse land degradation across 1 million hectares of land in 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and to benefit up to or more than 500,000 households. And you can see the countries on the map. They expand from Senegal in West Africa, including Mali, Niger, and Ghana, through to 4 East African countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Rwanda. So the program aims to achieve this ambition through integrating trees within crop, pastoral, and communal lands, but also integrating other soil and water conservation and other complementary practices. The main kind of approaches for incorporating trees are tree planting, grafting, in situ grafting, but also something called farmer managed natural regeneration. And farmer managed natural regeneration grew in popularity out of Niger, where it was very successful in restoring large areas. And I'll show a map of that, and supported by another Australian called Tony Ronaldo. And in this particular practice, we use the rootstock, the seeds within the soil, and the natural regeneration is then pruned to find the most successful stems. And that allows for faster growth, bringing back more indigenous species, and also within some of these very low rainfall areas, greater survival rate. So if you want to learn more about Regreening Africa, there's a website, a lot of social media, regreeningafrica.org. So from the last 10 years and looking back, there was some key reflections that came out that I wanted to share with all of you today. And the first is that large scale landscape restoration is taking place all over the world, but in very challenging environments. If I were to take this top example, the black and white 2 aerial photographs, this is from a Zinder region in Niger. Niger is one of the poorest countries. It has low rainfall, low education. Population density in this area is around 24 people per kilometer. Rainfall, kilometer squared, rainfall is around 450 millimeters. Back in around 1975, there was large scale food insecurity, land degradation, and there was a practice, this farmer managed natural regeneration practice was adapted from local practices and promoted through a number of different efforts. And over time, it led to, including policy changes, it led to a massive explosion of incorporating trees back into the landscape. And with all of those efforts, it brought greater food security, greater crop productivity, and all of the different elements associated with a healthier landscape. And the experience from there was one of them that is actually fed into this program called Regreening Africa, and promoted a belief that it's possible to undertake very ambitious large-scale restoration with very minimal government support and based mostly on community efforts. Here in the bottom photo, it's a hillside that was also regenerated using this farmer managed natural regeneration in northern Ghana. And within a period of about 3 years, they were able to bring back a huge amount of vegetation. The rainfall here is a little bit higher, probably 750 millimeters per annum, but the population density is also quite high. And also the farm sizes, both in Niger and in Ghana, are quite small. So here it might be 3 or 4 hectares per household. And Niger, depending on the area, it might be, again, 2, 3, 4 hectares. Now, the second key point that I think is very important, especially post-COP, so there was just a climate change conference of parties in Glasgow, is that climate change is not debated within the countries that I work in. It's very real, and people are adapting to survive. So within the context of East and West Africa, we're not debating its existence. People are experiencing very erratic rainfall. You can see this very clear graph from Lesotho, which is in Southern Africa, prepared by my colleague Torvagen, which shows the temperature changes and anomalies since 1850 and the very recent and continual rise in temperatures. For example, where I live in Nairobi, the rain season was supposed to start 1 month ago, and it's only just started, which means that all of the early planting that was done by farmers, much of the seed has been wasted, and now people need to repurchase if they have the money to buy new seed and to replant the fields, and then hoping that the rainy season will continue for long enough for them to have a crop. But this is also one of the reasons why regenerative agriculture, land restoration is so important, because this is a process for adaptation to improve the holding capacity of the land, the soil, and for communities to work together. Now, the third point I'd like to share is around continuous connection to land. The First Nation people and their continuous connection to land in Australia is very rare and extremely important. So I live here in Kenya, and my husband is Lul. He comes from Lake Victoria. His tribe migrated from South Sudan around 1000 or 1400 AD, and there was a Nilotic migration. Many of the tribes in Kenya have come originally from West Africa. There was a Bantu expansion, 2000 BC, that came across from west to east, and then it went back south and came back up. There are tribes that have lived here for much longer periods of time, but most of the people in Kenya are from more recent migrations. They have incredible local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, but that level of continuous caring for country that we have in Australia is not something that you find everywhere in the world. And I think it needs to be recognized as something that is unique, can be drawn from, and has a lot of positive side for caring for country in Australia. I think everyone working on land care knows that communities are central to this work. And the same is here in the African context within sub-Saharan Africa. And beyond communities, governance here is very, very critical. As I've mentioned, the population density is quite high. The government support is often quite low, and therefore communities must work together to find solutions and collectively work with government, but also with each other. So on the left, there's a photo of a woman from Senegal, and I was there just last month. This woman is from a town called, or from an area called Kaffrine, and she's holding a paper that is showing where she was given permission to own land. Now, this is quite unusual within the African context, but particularly within the Senegalese context. So she's holding a paper. Her husband said, "You can use this piece of land, it can be yours." And then the chief signed off. So the local government representative signed off on that ownership. And so she is now able to access and use land. But she's not doing that alone. All of those women sitting behind her have now come together as part of a cooperative. They're growing vegetables for their families, as well as seedlings, trees, and now starting to process some of the fruits such as baobab to sell so that they can make income. And this sort of shift in collective action and the shift in governance is very important. In the top photo, this is also from Senegal. This is a forestry officer. They call them eaux de forêt, and they're usually kind of a paramilitary type of forestry officer. Within those communities, most of the trees are actually not owned outright by the landholder. You must get a permit to be able to chop down any tree on your land, and regardless of where in the land it sits, which is different to the West Australian context, and to be able to use it to sell or for timber or any excessive pruning. In this particular case, the process to get the permit is extremely bureaucratic. and can be open to bribes and a number of processes so that the community feel that they do not want to plant trees because they do not feel that they own the tree products and that the process is discouraging. And so there's a dialogue ongoing with the Eau de Forêt in Senegal and building on some very, very positive policy movements within Niger, also in West Africa, and an interest in some of the other countries to start shifting ownership back to the community so that they have an incentive to undertake land management and to bring trees back on their land. Another example from the gender work is on this photo on the left. It's in Ghana. An incredible lady called Gloria has been undertaking her PhD to look at gender roles and relationships in northern Ghana and to see what is possible within household discussions to shift some of the gender norms. So within that example, there's been a number of workshops, activities between husbands and wives to look at roles and relationships and to see if any of those can shift to have more balance, both in the household roles, but also in the land management roles, with the idea that shifting some of these gender roles and relationships and norms, women will be able to have more access to land and be part of the land management decisions, and men will also take up some of the roles within the household. Obviously, this varies between countries within the world. Within Australia, we have, I think, still some way to go. And within these places in northern Ghana, a shift even for a man to help in the household at all is quite incredible. And we're starting to see that within that particular environment. The photo on the other side is of these half moons back in Niger. These half moons are very, very critical in these low rainfall environments. So I think I mentioned it's about 450 millimeters per year, but this is in one wet season, and then the dry season is incredibly dry with a lot of dust and wind. So these half moons are collectively built by the community. People come together and support one farm one day, another farm the next day. And in this way, they can collect water and nutrients to grow trees and also to plant their crops. But these forms of collective action are incredibly critical for land management and also for people's survival within the landscape. There's very little input, as I mentioned, from government or from outside sources. And I think it's good to acknowledge that within the areas that I'm living, landscape management involves very, very diverse practices and has to consider livelihood benefits and outcomes. None of this land, you can separate the environment from the people. It must be working continuously together. So this is a photo from near where I live, actually. It's from Makweni, and it shows some terraces. These are quite small. That area has a huge number of terraces that again are built through people working together on one farm one day, one farm the next. Some grass strips, a combination of indigenous and exotic trees. So the exotic trees mostly to bring fruit. There is a lot of challenges in promoting indigenous tree species within some of these landscapes because the exotics, largely from Australia, eucalyptus, grevillea and others, are very fast growing in these landscapes and therefore bring profit and are good for timber or firewood. Some of the local species are slightly slower growing and there is a perception that they will not mature and give profit as fast. So we've been putting a lot of work into finding local indigenous species that can give profit, but also promoting practices like farmer managed natural regeneration to bring back what's naturally in the land. Because as we adapt to climate change, we also need to ensure that there are species that will be able to survive through the changes in rainfall. And just a few more examples of different landscape management or different practices. These photos are from Ethiopia. So within Ethiopia, and I just want to acknowledge that Ethiopia is currently undergoing an extremely difficult conflict, a very heartbreaking conflict within the country. A lot of our colleagues and our work has actually had to move out of the Tigray region, and we're really hoping for a very peaceful resolution and for that to come soon for the people of Ethiopia, of Tigray. So on the left is a photo from a tree nursery. Ethiopia has had tree planting campaigns up to, I think, even 1 billion trees, I think I hear being talked about now. There are, of course, some challenges because without managing aspects like grazing, who will water the seedling? Is it the right tree seedling or the right type of tree species for that area? The survival rate of a lot of those species is low. But with this shift to a focus on trees, on greening, there is also a lot of job opportunities. In this particular nursery, this woman and other youth and women are able to make some money helping with the nursery. And there is a shift to making these nurseries community owned and to be run as businesses rather than by the government. So Ethiopia, this Tigray region, has extremely high, it's over 100 people per kilometre squared. And I think if you compare that to the central wheat belt, which is about 0.37 people per kilometre squared. It's a huge population density. And again, it has marginal rainfall. This is from another closure, this photo on the side. And this is a professor, Professor Mieke, who actually helped establish Mekelle University in Tigray, showing the community how they can further use these closures. So as I mentioned, the closures are a social fencing, an opportunity for the community with the government to select an area to close off for a period of time to allow the trees and the vegetation to restore. The community are often able to take out grasses, so cut and carry to their animals. There's a big push towards this cut and carry system to stop open grazing, because the open grazing can often lead to degradation. But within those closures, there also needs to be other opportunities to make money for the community. So here they're looking at the tree species that are best for bees and to create honey. There's a very popular white honey from that area, and identifying those tree species that they can help to regenerate so that they can make more income from the land. This is from Ghana, and as I mentioned, I was there last month, and this is a fairly typical household setup where you have the main house and then the cooking areas are often outside in smaller huts. They've brought their crop in this case, it's okra and chili, and these are very, very popular in West Africa. And we're all looking at an energy saving stove. So there's also a lot of effort to bring in not just the trees, but also how do we reduce the pressure on those trees? So energy saving stoves mean less pressure on the vegetation, also less time for firewood collection, because this is still the main source of cooking fuel for many of the countries within sub-Saharan Africa. And then also the women in the past, particularly where it's closed spaces, there's a lot of problems with the smoke from the stoves. And so these improved stoves are meant to improve in terms of the health benefits as well. And the last example I want to give is this is a recent tree planting event with a youth group in Nairobi. This is Lucian. He has started a group, and I think it's about to become an NGO called Trees for Goals. He is 16 years old, and when he was quite young, he decided he wanted to do something about the loss of trees in Nairobi. And so every time he scores a goal, he plants 11 trees, and over time, he's brought his family, his friends on board, and now he's scaling out to all of these different schools. So the one that we're at here is it's a Huruma, it's a children's home next to some hills. And once they finish with the school, then they can move on to starting to restore the degraded hills. Now, the youth within Kenya are a huge percentage of the population. Under 15 is 43% of the population. So looking to the youth as the custodians, as the next generation that will sustain this land is incredibly important. And I think empowering them in that process has value. So a few last thoughts from my side. Be ambitious, dream and act big. You can also act local and small, but I think there's a lot to be done. There is a huge amount of potential. We have a lot of resources in Western Australia in terms of First Nation people knowledge, in terms of the knowledge of many people working on land care over many, many years. There is a lot to build on. There is a lot of land that needs to be restored. There is government support and there are resources. And these are things that are not existing in a lot of the places that I'm working. I would say, look to the youth and include them. Let's ensure that they are inspired and part of the process. And let's also look out. I think Western Australia still has, I know many people do offer their knowledge and support to other countries in the world. But when I look at the countries I'm working in sub-Saharan Africa, I often feel that experience from Western Australia, particularly around catchment management, water management, could have a lot of benefit for many of these nations. It takes everybody. I think inclusion is critical. I think it will take everyone working together to overcome some of the challenges that lie ahead for our land and for our communities. And let's build on the social capital that's already been established through land care and keep building on that community work. I think there is so much to build from and so much to look forward to. So with that, I say thank you, or asante, as we say in Kiswahili. And I really appreciate the time. Here's some details on Regreening Africa, and I look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Mieke. And I just want to let people know that Mieke was up at before 4:30 a.m. this morning in order to be here in real time. So really appreciate your dedication, Mieke. And I just wanted to ask a question before I put it across to everybody. So you can certainly be asking questions, so get them ready. I'll come to you with the microphone because otherwise Mieke won't be able to hear you. Mieke, you've been there for a decade and you're clearly seeing a change on the ground, and also the work that you're doing clearly is right in line with some of the terminology around regenerative agriculture. But I mean, it's been there well before that term was coined, which says if you don't have people in the system, so it's not about just sustainable agriculture, it's about sustainable communities. What has been the sources of the most hope for you over the last decade? You know, what keeps you going? And you're saying that Regreening Africa, that major funding finishes next year. Well, the job's not finished. So what gives you hope and what's next?
Thank you so much, Lou. And I completely agree. I think to talk about land management without community and without healthy community is missing part of the puzzle. And that is very, very apparent here because of the high population density as well. There is no space that you can talk about that doesn't include people in their communities. In terms of hope, I see a lot. Actually, on Saturday, I'm heading to Djibouti for a conversation about the Great Green Wall. So there's an ambition or a commitment, about a Pan-African commitment to create a green wall, or at least a brownie green wall across below the Sahara, across Africa, to restore land, particularly in very highly degraded areas. There has been a huge amount of commitment from governments, from donors, from others to work together towards that. But mostly it's when I go to the field and I see the work that is happening. In Ghana recently, seeing the amount of restoration that's happening of share parklands that are providing income to women within those communities and what's possible, seeing change in fire management within those areas over a short period of time, coming even within Kenya to some of the areas and seeing the change that is possible with very, very few resources. So I'm very, very hopeful that we can embed a lot of these changes. And I think the policy changes are really important for that too.
Thanks, Mieke. So I'll put it over to you for some questions for Mieke, or comments, questions. Great. Can you just let Mieke know where you're from? That would help her.
I'm from Wise Salts Incorporated. I live in Geraldton, WA. I suppose I know that. Yeah, what I question, I see there's mention of water management, but there's no mention of soil, water, air management, which is all combined together to recreate the balance that was there before we cleared the land. Now, notice on the photos, there's a lot of bush, so it's only parkland cleared basically where that photo is. But, you know, the main thing is people don't seem to understand that water, soil and air have to go together. They can't be separated.
Thanks, Jim. Mieke, a comment about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that inspires me every time I go to the community is that they're actually not separating many of these things. Often we work in sectors, we'll work in agriculture, we'll work in livestock, we'll work in water as if they're separate. But when we go to the community, it is one and the same. And I think the same can be said for the balance. And the degree to which the community takes up these practices, however, will be the degree to which they can see the benefit. And so I think one of our roles is to make sure that some of these combinations have benefits, that there's incentives. There's incentives to sustain that work and to bring in these different parts. But I completely agree. I think air, water and soil must go together.
Thanks, Mieke. Yep.
Hi, I'm sorry it's so early in the morning. I'm Stephen Jones from the Friends of Yonka Burl on the Susanna Brook Reserve. I'd just like to know how you engage the youth of our society. Look around the room, we're all going to die pretty soon, we're all old. How do we get our claws into the youth to be engaged with us to look after our land?
Thanks, Stephen. Over to you, Mieke.
That's a great question, and I think we all struggle with that wherever we are in the world. Within the context of sub-Saharan Africa, we've asked the youth what would it take to be involved, and from their perspective, there's three things that come up. They want to be listened to and be part of the decision making, be part of the planning, feel some ownership. They also want money, so there needs to be an economic side. There also has to be a business side for them often to be involved, at least within this part of the world. And they want to be given capacity and opportunity to learn. So within our context, that's what we're trying to work on. And I think this recent tree planting with Lucienne and the Trees for Goals also made me realize we have to reframe it into a language that works for them. If it's through football or soccer that inspires people, then we go through that language. And I think within Australia, a lot of the coastal management has worked on that. But I think it's around finding the language that works for the youth and giving them opportunities and also giving them a seat at the table to be part of the decision making.
Thanks, Mieke. And I think we all feel very inspired by Trees for Goals. I mean, I immediately went, yeah, I think that would work. Did you think that would work? Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the younger crew down the back here.
Marhaba, Mieke. So I'm Pierre. I'm working for the Coastal and Marine Community Network, but I was working for NGO as well in Burkina Faso and Comoros. So my question, because obviously I've got a French accent, so I'm one of the descendants of the colonizer of West Africa. And just how do you manage to empower communities to make sure that they are self-sufficient and ideas come from them and not from European-funded NGO, because that's been 1 century of we've been telling the people how to do agriculture, how to regenerate their land in a way that at the end, all the resources went to Europe. The climate change is not the responsibility of the whole continent of Africa, but from Europe again or Western countries, because the 50 plus countries of Africa have got nothing to do with climate change at the moment. So in the same way than people here in WA, the First Nation people, still victim of the way the native titles are managed. How you do make sure that the community are self-sufficient at the end of all your projects?
Go for it, Mieke.
Okay, I think that's a really important question, and I think we probably don't have all the answers. I completely agree. It's about climate justice. It's about adaptation here. It is not about mitigation when we talk about climate change. A lot of the projects are still donor-driven. The funding for this project that I work on comes from the European Union. But I think we have a responsibility with that donor funding to see how we also shape change at the community that responds to community need and community request. So a lot of the work now, as we exit the program, is around making sure that the policies are in place, that the community structures are in place to take forward the areas of work that the community have identified as being necessary, to work around value chains, to work around products that have been identified as important by the community so that there is an incentive, to find other mechanisms that are going to incentivize the continuation of this work. And I think every time we enter into a community, it has to respond to community need and a community expressed desire to work in a particular way. But I do think, I mean, within Regreening Africa, we work with some of the world's largest NGOs, And it is a little bit of a tanker sometimes that needs to shift slowly in terms of the way the community is worked with within these countries. But I think policy changes, local institutions, and strengthening those to continue the work and incentives have to be a central part of our work.
Thanks, Mieke, and I think what you're identifying is that it's an ongoing challenge, but it's actually about every single one of us that is working in communities making sure we actually really understand what are the community drivers and really hearing that right up front, so you don't come in with your project, you come in with a discussion to understand the local communities, as you have done in the past too. Yep. Other questions? Yep.
Mieke, my name's Greg Warburton from the 2J Friends of the River. I think you've got the biggest job description of any I've ever heard of in the world. An amazing task you've taken on. I'm just wondering, what is the reaction from an African subsistence farmer when you try and impart the message of land care? Is it a hard message to get across? Because traditional farming practices in Africa are anything but. From what I can see, it's often about degradation and exploitation of the land.
Actually, I think land care is something that is just embedded actually within the culture. There's such strong social capital. There's such a strong sense of working together, to working collectively to find solutions to community problems, without necessarily looking for input even from the government. I think very much community-led really resonates here. So in the places where I've seen enough community-level facilitators be there to support the groups, land care has grown dramatically. What I've seen in Uganda, for example, is incredible. There's bylaws at the community level that are managing the interaction between the community and national parks. There's a huge junior land care program within schools. Within West Uganda, there's now work going on in the north. Restoration of degraded hill slopes that used to have landslides that have stopped. I think the community are very, very willing to work collectively, and that is the way that they do things. So I think land care actually works incredibly well here and is responded to in a very, very positive way.
Thanks, Mieke. I think there was another question. Excuse me, Oliver. Thank you.
Hi, Mieke. My name is Carol Innes, and I just want to say congratulations and thank you so much for providing an overview of the work that you've been doing over the last 10 years. And I think your point around Indigenous knowledge from my part and many of our mob who are been saying that for so long. A lot of changed here in WA since you left 10 years ago. We are on the brink of the implementation of the Southwest Settlement across the whole of the Southwest region. So your point around Indigenous knowledge is one that resonates really strongly with me, because there's not many people in the room here that are Indigenous, and this is the state conference for land care network, and but I hope your message to the people in the room is taken on board, because we've been talking about that for some time. Many of our people here have gone into purchasing of farms and managing their own restoration and regeneration of farms back into that, and Uncle Laura Maguire has clearly done that over the last 15 years, and is an amazing point for that. So we have got what you're doing here as a very powerful tool. But I really like what you're doing. I congratulate you. Like the bloke earlier said, your job is mammoth. I think the key point from this point going forward, if we're going to engage powerfully across Western Australia to regenerate our country, we don't want to see the patchwork, what's happening between here and Kalgoorlie, of massive farm practice. We've got to look at repairing the damage. And I think the donor-led process you talked around of funding, we need to engage very powerfully on a government space, because the government were the ones who instigated the 1 million acres of clearing for production of food resource. So that's the big shift here. We all know that we have a competitive space between agriculture and regeneration, and I guess that's what we've got to drive hard home here. I am honoured to hear your knowledge and experience, and I just want to say thank you for sharing that with us today.
Mieke, did you want to comment a bit further on, some of those challenges of really changing that thinking? Because, as was commented a little earlier, some of the early agricultural directions were not sustainable, were not appropriate. And so you've already referred to the fact that actually Indigenous populations and culture did have sustainable practices. But we then had the Green Revolution, whether it was called that or not in Africa. We had a whole range of other directions that were actually destructive and now are having to be really turned around. Can you just speak to that journey of really trying to recapture some of the earlier knowledge?
Yeah, I can give a few thoughts. I appreciate that I've been away for 10 years, and I'm actually really looking forward, once Western Australia lets me back in, to come home and to see a little bit of what's been happening. It's been a couple of years now for me. The Green Revolution is a very challenging one. Obviously, I'm also working in India, and there's been an incredible program to reclaim some of the Indigenous farming practices and looking back to traditional farming practices. Within the African context, we actually have the Green Revolution for Africa, which is being pushed at the moment. So it's definitely not over, and it's still being very heavily promoted. And it's about trying to find some balance between that push and traditional practices. Within Australia, there was a very long period of promoting clearing. I think one of my first jobs in the Department of, I think it was Environment then, was around clearing permits. And I had a lot of conversations with property managers around clearing permits and their frustration in the change that had happened, because they were told to clear and now they were being told not to clear. And this sort of shift in policy and the way that happened was seen as unfair by some and seen as positive by others. And I don't think we can't undo what was done in terms of the practices, but I think we can learn. And I think within Western Australia, we have the opportunity to learn and to act faster than many of the other places. I often look back at my home and I realize how much there is, how much incredible land there is, how much knowledge there is, how much resource there is available from government, but also from other sectors, from the community in terms of time, knowledge. And I do think that maybe what we need to be looking at is how do we learn faster and be more ambitious in the change that is possible. I think Western Australia has everything to lead the way in redefining how agriculture looks for the state, in redefining how land management looks, how it incorporates everybody, how we bring in the incredible knowledge of the First Nation people into how we manage the land. I think Western Australia has that potential and could be a beacon to many places in the world. It doesn't completely answer, but that's my few thoughts on that.
Yep, thanks, Mieke. I think that's a crack on with it. People, you've got a lot of resource to use. Yep.
Hi, Mieke. My name's Francis. I work for Landcare Serpentine Jarrahdale. One of your early slides showed the Global Landcare logo. Global Landcare as an organisation is relatively new and driven initially by Australian landcare pioneers and largely managed in Australia. What role are they playing in supporting the African landcare network?
Thanks so much. And I was hoping to talk a little bit more about global landcare. So when I first came here, I was working on African Landcare Network, and we also had something called Landcare International, which was more like a network of passionate landcarers around the world. And we worked very closely with Australian Landcare International, which was the Australian branch. And then there was another one called Silk that also worked on landcare internationally. And the three organizations decided to merge to become Global Landcare, to have a more global focus and also to align across the three organizations. And so at the moment, it's still very much led from Australia, building on Australian Landcare International, but we are trying to increase. So I'm on the board and we're trying to increase the board membership to have many of the other countries represented and to start shifting to having more ownership from other countries. But Australian Landcare International or Global Landcare has had a really incredible impact. They have a program that's a small grants program where people donate whatever they like, and then they have around 500 Australian dollars going to groups within all the different countries around the world where there's landcare work. And I've seen the impact of these small grants. They can set up a homeschool, a school garden or a junior landcare work in a school within Uganda. Locally, they also supported buying catering equipment so that the group could restore a degraded hillside, nursery establishment, quite a range of incredible projects. So that has been one of the really influential aspects, but also a lot of training. So I think Keith probably is maybe the only one from Western Australia that's come over, Keith Bradbury, to be part of some of the trainings, but others from the East Coast have come over and been part of supporting and mentoring facilitators, landcare facilitators within Africa and also globally. So they've had a huge role, and it's been a really positive interaction from Australia to some of these other countries.
Thanks, Mieke, because we don't actually hear about that very often, so it's really great to know that it exists and to be supporting government who do provide some small support through DFAT for that and through other avenues.
Hi, Mieke. Thanks for a really fantastic presentation. My name's Renee. I'm from the WA Biodiversity Science Institute. And I was just wondering if you can shed some light on what's happening with the carbon market over in Africa and the associated plantings that are going on, I guess particularly in regards to offsets. And if you're seeing a threat of monoculture plantings as opposed to ecological restoration from those investments.
Damn fine question there, Renee.
And a very timely question, because it's been a huge topic of discussion over here, leading up to the climate change COP, and then after that, it's also had a mushroom. I've been reached out to by so many different organizations wanting to look for carbon offsets and for trading and building on some of the work that we've been doing. I think there's a lot of potential benefit and some challenges potentially with the carbon trading. One of the big benefits could be that it may incentivize continuation of practice. So once there's been a change in a landscape, as an incentive to keep the trees, to keep the restoration in place, this carbon money could potentially go to landholders as an incentive. One of the negatives, of course, they talk about quality carbon, so diverse plantings, much more conscientious of community roles and participation and equity, but I think that's hard to manage. So I think we have a really important role in ensuring that if there is carbon offset, that the community gets the bulk of the profit, not the trader, that there's biodiverse planting, that it's equitable within the context of the countries I work in. Most of the money at this stage would go to the household head, which is male. And in polygamous families where there's many, many wives, that would even become more complicated in terms of distribution of revenue, who would make the money. How do you deal with community land and community planting? And can we look beyond the carbon? It should be carbon plus social benefit, plus biodiversity and local food security. So we're going to be pushing a lot more for that. And I am in discussion with some of the different carbon traders, but I think that has to be a prerequisite. Otherwise, the benefit to the community, they'll be probably selling it too cheap, and it could have perverse impacts on the way restoration takes place. I think it's really important.
I might just add there that the WA Landcare Network and the National Landcare Network are very actively involved with conversations about how can we gain the most for landcare out of the carbon market to make sure that we have biodiversity outcomes that the farmers actually benefit primarily, and not the carbon service providers, whom I consider to be maybe in the shark category rather than the vegetarians. So we are trying to scour the seascape to find the vegetarians. And there are some really good vegetarians that I think that we could partner with. So just watch that space. We're certainly working hard in that area, and appreciate that anybody who would like to participate in those discussions. And you would have seen also that that we have got a carbon industry overview. There's a couple of copies out there. It's on the website. That's just one little aspect. And also the department has got some resources in this area too, with the Land Restoration Fund, but that's just one aspect of it, but it's a good one. So I think there's another question there over there with Bruce.
Hello, Mieke. Bruce Ivers is my name, and I run a little business called Trees Australia. I take school children tree planting. In the last 6 years, we've had over 5,000 students through our program, and we've planted in excess of 320,000 seedlings. So that's my little bit towards this, but I'd like to thank you for your presentation today. It's fabulous hearing what you're doing. Looking back at Australia from Africa, you talked about us thinking big and dreaming big. What do you think some of those thoughts and big dreams could be?
Okay, that's a good question. And please take what I say with a small grain of salt, because I have not been living there for a while, so things may have changed since I left. But I'm really quite inspired by some of the work around restoring land in connection with First Nation people, as well as with communities. So restoring parts of land in a contiguous link. I think the work, it's exciting to hear what you're doing with school children. I think that is a really critical part of it. I think the environmental stewardship, the engagement of youth, their understanding and creating a love for the environment from a young age is critical. I think a huge education component, a huge component with school children is important. But I also think that the way we look at managing and what can be considered good management of large tracts of land probably needs to be reconsidered. I know there's a very topical discussion around fires, so I won't necessarily go into that, but there's discussion around how fire management is taking place. But there's also, within the farming landscape, I think there could be a lot of space for bringing in other practices that bring more biodiversity, that integrate different forms of practices that are probably happening but could be massively scaled up. So I think there's a combination of probably incentives, an understanding of what good land management is, a conversation around what's been working well, and then in those pieces of land where we can look for more complete restoration, looking at it in that way. One of the things that we're doing in Northern Ghana at the moment is a Northern Restoration Initiative. So looking across the whole of Northern Ghana and saying, what would it look like to restore this land across the farmland, across the communal lands, and having a conversation with the private sector, with the communities, with the local government, and kind of imagining that together. And I feel in a way that probably takes place in parts of Western Australia, but maybe that's something that needs to take place in a bigger way. If we look at this whole area, what does it look like for all of us? What does it have? And mapping that out together and kind of looking at quite big areas of land. And I think it is possible.
I think that that's a really good place to let Mieke go and have her second coffee and some breakfast for the morning. Because I think that it's that being ambitious and also not to wait. Yes, we need to keep on advocating to have governments come on board. But what I think that clearly the message that's coming through from Mieke is that the people that are in the room and other community members who are the drivers for change, governments then come on board, but we need to be inspired and to be driving those processes and doing everything within our capacity to make those changes together collectively in our communities. And having a clear vision of what it might look like and being ambitious about it is highly motivating. And bringing children actually understand that, they hook on to big pictures and being motivated very readily, don't they, Bruce? So what we're going to do before we have a well-deserved morning tea break is I'd like you to just to break out into small groups with the people who are sitting the next seat behind you. So every second seat turns around into little groups of 3 or 4. And what I'd like you to discuss is, what do you take from this presentation that you can take to the work that you do? So just having that reflective discussion, and it's just going to be for 10 minutes, and then we're going to break for morning tea. Can you self-organise? Usually Landcare people are pretty good at that. Thank you very much to Mieke before we break up.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your gathering.
Thank you so much, Mieke. It's been really deeply inspiring to have those reflections from out of Western Australia back into Landcare here. Thank you very much for making your time available.
Thank you. Bye.